Hello everyone, welcome to yet another day in this, the clown decade, the decade where things are going to get worse before they get better, and thankfully today it is a video where Liz Truss is saying, I told you so. I told you so to all the people that cooed her out of her position as PM, to all the people that said that she destroyed the economy, and to all the people that said that she was a mad right-wing nut, who was a free market freak who wanted to drop all taxation and have absolutely no public spending whatsoever, despite the fact that she was cutting one particular tax with an income of a few million and just stopping tax rises for absolutely every other tax that was in the works, and in fact not cutting spending but actually giving some useful subsidies for people's energy bills, although there was a bit of a problem there as well. So to all those in the back saying, more detail man, more detail, Liz Truss gave a half-hour speech for the Institute for Government and then spent an hour or so answering questions from the journalists present. And the BBC have a quick summary of what she said. Liz Truss urges PM to cut taxes a year after Downing Street exit, because it's a good idea to cut taxes when they are historically at their highest point since World War II, and absolutely none of it seems to be being spent well. Liz Truss has vehemently defended the policies she tried to enact during her short time as Prime Minister. She acknowledged that she tried to do things in a rush in her time in office, but the Tory MP argued that she could not deliver her plans due to the political and economic establishment, blaming institutional bureaucracy, which did seem to be the case. It seemed to be the case that a lot of MPs did not want her and instead wanted Rishi Sunak, as he was, and I quote, a good pair of hands for the economy. Well, that's not gone any particularly better than Liz Truss's time in office, it seems. And she was obviously going directly against the civil service and the Bank of England, two largely entrenched institutions within the United Kingdom's government. So obviously trying to take on two rather large government institutions at once and at the same time go against half her party's wishes, that was obviously going to end in tears. And I think the worst part of it is that she wasn't even vehemently cutting taxes or spending, she was cutting one particular tax, not raising others that were planned to be raised, and then actually what was predicted at the time by her own office, spending as much as the furlough scheme, though the poorly explained idea at the time was to have complete supply side reform so that business are massively incentivised to come back to Britain, grow the economy that way, and then what do you know, you're making more tax than ever. The former PM also called on Rishi Sunak to cut taxes, reduce benefit increases, raise the retirement age, and delay net zero commitments. Her speech at an event held by the Institute for Government think tank comes almost a year after her government unveiled a series of economic measures described as a mini-budget that included £45 billion of tax cuts alongside support for people struggling with rising energy bills, and already the BBC is telling a bit of a fib, because again there was only one tax cut and that was on the 45p rate, and the estimated costs of that cut will have been about £2 billion. The £45 billion comes from the fact that they were not going to raise corporation tax and other taxes, which were estimated to bring in £45 billion. But the problem is that sometimes you raise taxes, a lot of businesses leave, and then you actually get less in tax revenue. And you would certainly get less than projected. However, Truss did put on Twitter some details of these plans of hers on Twitter, and the first one is about growing the economy. Almost a year on, I still believe in my vision for Britain. We must be bold if we want to make Britain grow again. And I completely agree. So in this little graphic as Prime Minister, I sought to abandon the 25-year stale economic consensus, tackle the cosy vested interests, and get Britain out of this debt spiral by gripping public spending and implementing policies to grow the economy. Under my growth plan, government spending would have been £35.5 billion lower by 2025, which may seem like a drop in the ocean given that this year's figures estimate it to be about £784 billion, but it's still a good start. And when there is a drop in government spending, that's good news for the taxpayer, because that usually is followed by some drops in taxes, and also possibly some useful subsidies, but this is government we're talking about. Next up, environmental policy, which thank God, because now that I live in Wales, environmental policy has meant that there are more road rage incidents, at least for my anecdotes. For those who don't know, that is due to the fact that the Welsh Government decided to blanket change all 30 mile per hour zones to 20 miles per hour, including main roads, and trust me, it makes driving so much more depressing. So Liz Truss says these net zero commitments make the cost of living crisis worse by hitting households in the pocket, which is the main issue with pretty much all green and eco policy. We must delay implementing net zero commitments. I mean, I'd much rather she go big rather than go home and say that we just completely ignore all net zero commitments, such as the ban on new petrol and diesel vehicles from 2030. Yes, I am for that. We must abandon environmental regulations like enforcing the replacement of gas and oil boilers with heat pumps. Yes, I would also agree with that. I don't see the issue with giving people the choice on what they do to help the environment, especially if part of the government plan is to involve carbon capture and storage, because I literally can't think of a more effective way of helping the climate emergency if you are a left-wing loon than by literally taking the greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere and pumping them underground where they will be stored. Given that oil and gas is stored underground for millennia, I think it's a pretty good idea and a pretty sound one. It will just be quite expensive, but I'd much rather it be done via tax incentives on private companies or literally just done by central government. You know, I'm not mad enough to say that everything that central government does is useless. Next up, Truss says as Conservatives we must do everything possible to get Britain out of this debt spiral. Yes, please. We can't keep having very expensive ways of getting money. The national debt. In 2005, the national debt was £525 billion. By 2022, that had quintupled to £2.5 trillion. UK debt levels are close to 100% of GDP, and we have the highest debt interest payments in the developed world. Now, if we can get the national debt on the public debate, I think it would do very well for Liz Truss's whole let's actually get the economy growing platform, because while everyone else gives it lip service, all their plans are to do is to effectively keep borrowing money to pay off pensions. And well, I've mentioned that earlier, but Truss also mentions the pension triple lock, but of course she also goes straight into taxes. Families and businesses are being squeezed under the highest tax burden since the Second World War. Cutting taxes will put more money in people's pockets. We have the highest tax burden since the Second World War. Someone earning $100,000 with student loans face a marginal tax rate of 71%. It's a little bit of sleight of hand there. Student loans aren't technically a tax, but the repayments are based off your income. And even then, if you're earning £90,000, the marginal tax rate, I believe, is 61%, which is still quite mad. I still remember my economics teacher just 14 years ago telling us that he worked out that every Friday he was working for the government. Or in other words, at the end of the month, his paycheck would see about a fifth of his wage go straight to the government. And given that he was a senior teacher at a relatively prestigious school, I am just going to go ahead and assume that he was on a lot more money than I am now, probably about double, and I am currently paying just over 20% of my wage to the government, which screams to me that yes, tax burdens have shot up. The UK is third after Russia and China for the departure of high net worth individuals. Can't say I particularly blame them, but these are the cash cows, and if you do raise the tax enough or you do kill the golden goose, then well, you've killed the golden goose and they fly elsewhere. Companies like AstraZeneca have relocated because of high corporation tax, costing us jobs. Yes, I am aware that people will call this type of thing trickle-down economics, but the reality of it is yes, if the tax burden is far too high and businesses are completely disincentivised from actually doing business here, you're going to see a loss of jobs. It happens everywhere, so you may as well just be a tax haven. They're all rich. But for those of you who have been following the channel long enough, you will know that I am very much on the side of the free market, and you will know that I am very much on Liz Truss's side. Back when she was in the leadership race, and in fact when she was the PM, I was a rather large apologist for her, and I am still a rather large apologist because she did pretty much nothing wrong. Obviously that's a bit of hyperbole on my part. There were some things she could have done differently, but I think ultimately, as soon as she was in office, she was doomed to fail. They would have found anything and everything they could to get her out of office, whether that be the media, the Tory MPs themselves, who were more Lib Dem than they were Tory, or whether it was the Bank of England or the civil service. So it's good to see that she is doubling down on all this, because at the end of the day, at the moment we are in a problem that is actually the same, if not worse, than when she was in office, despite the fact we have followed the IMF's and the OBR's recovery recommendations, and hell, we've hardly recovered. Mortgage rates are at 6%, we're still borrowing a hell of a lot more than ever, and we are still taxed a hell of a lot more than ever, all while barely anything in Britain seems to be really improving. So let's get back to the article. The speech is one of the few occasions she has spoken in public about her tenure, and she said, "Some people said we're in too much of a rush, and it is certainly true that I didn't try to fatten the pig on market day. I tried to rear the pig and slaughter it as well. I confess to that. But the reason we were in a rush is because the voters wanted to see results," and that's true. "I knew with the level of resistance and the lack of preparation time that things weren't going to be perfect." And I think that's a fair thing to reflect on. I think that's a fair thing to say. She said that communication could have been better and the operation better honed, but also that she was unable to implement her plans because there was a powerful force compromising the economic and political elite, corporatists, part of the media, and even section of the Conservative Parliamentary Party opposed to her ideas, and they were all quite open about that. So if anyone says this is a conspiracy, all you really need to do is Google back to her tenure, just find any news, any press release from the Conservative Party, and you'll see pretty much everyone was against her. She also argued that the tax cuts were not unfunded and they would have increased revenue in the long term. Specifically the ones in the mini-budget, probably not, unless rich people getting 5p for every pound they make over 100,000 was ended up being spent on a lot more. I don't think it will have brought in more revenue, unless she means beyond the mini-budget, in which she was planning to cut taxes, genuinely cut them, rather than just not raise them. In addition to reflecting on her time in office, Ms Truss used her speech to urge the government to reinstate VAT-free shopping for tourists and abolish the windfall tax on oil and gas firms. Well, I'm not entirely sure on the VAT-free shopping for tourists. VAT seems one of the only justifiable taxes, given that it's an actual voluntary tax. But when it comes to windfall, yeah, ever since the windfall tax, energy companies have just refused to reinvest into the UK because they're not making money on it. Because 75% of their profits just get reaped up straight away. And the only reason we're doing that is because the government is completely anti-business and thinks if anyone is making any sort of money in a quote-unquote crisis, then they're just being greedy and not helping their fellow man. And in reality, it's meant that we don't have any new nuclear reactors being built or being invested in. It's just the reality of the problem, and Liz Truss sees it. "We need to get a grip on the ballooning welfare and pension bill. This means slowing the rate of increases to benefit and tougher work requirements. It also means raising the retirement age further," she said. Well, that's probably a good idea because out of all benefits, the state pension is the one that is squeezing Britain the most. But the problem is that we've had Tories in for 13 years, and the biggest voting bloc for Tories is pensioners. So if you say, we're going to raise the pension age and give you less in the state pension, you are not asking for an awful lot at the ballot box. Unless you can convince them, of course, that the growth in the economy is going to mean a stronger pound and therefore the things they buy are either going to be cheaper or they'll have more money from the state pension in real terms, or, basically make a case that they're not going to lose money. But I think she's going to have a hard time doing that. So there were the main points from her speech. It is now time to get into the question and answer session. So, during a question session following her speech, Ms Truss further defended her policies. Following her mini-budget, interest rates jumped sharply, leading to rising mortgages and hundreds of products being removed from the mortgage market. However, the former Prime Minister said interest rates had been artificially low for many years and would have risen regardless of her policies, and that part is absolutely true. We have been in a state of quantitative easing since 2008. Gordon Brown sold off all our gold, and effectively we have just been money printing with extra steps, and part of the way of trying to combat inflation is to have these very low interest rates, which makes borrowing money cheap. However, given that quantitative easing is just printing money with extra steps, you have a big genuine crisis like COVID and the lockdown, and you have to do a massive government spending push to make sure hundreds of thousands of people aren't going to die, at least from the projections and models that you have made within the government. Then, a few years down the line, you are just asking for trouble, because this very slow process of money printing with extra steps, it's had to be accelerated to a point where it is just directly printing money, effectively. And then you hit inflation to 11%, and, well, how do you combat massive inflation like that? You make the cost of borrowing money even higher, in other words, raise interest rates. And to say this was all down to Liz Truss is, to be honest, quite a bit mad. It's obviously not been down to Liz Truss. We went through the recovery plan. None of it's actually worked. And in fact, during Liz Truss's time, we were on board and parallel to other global trends. So to say that it was the free market that did this, it's just absurd. Ms. Truss also criticised the civil service, saying that while she had worked with brilliant people, there was a system problem. Asking for examples of the civil service interference, she said officials tended to be more enthusiastic and active when implementing climate policies compared to delivering the government's plan to send migrants to Rwanda. Well, no duh. I know civil servants who have literally switched departments over that. She also hit back at Mark Carney, the former Bank of England governor, who over the weekend said Ms Truss had failed to turn the UK into Singapore on Thames, but instead delivered Argentina on the Channel. Which again is an absurd thing to say, because nothing she actually wanted was implemented. The only thing she managed to do was stop the ban on fracking, and Sunak overturned that within a week. Ms Truss said Mr Carney had contributed to the 25-year economic consensus that had led to low growth across the Western world. Having largely spent the past year since leaving number 10 keeping a lower profile, Ms Truss is likely to become more vocal in the next 12 months. She's writing a book due for publication in April entitled 10 Years to Save the West, in which she will share the lessons from her time in government. She will also attend the Conservative Party conference in Manchester later this month. So, in other words, I am going to expect a lot of entertainment from Ms Truss. But needless to say, she is absolutely on the warpath when it comes to absolutely everywhere where I personally see a problem, and I'm sure a lot of you see a problem in Britain. And the thing is, this speech inevitably got a lot of people saying, oh look, she's still a crank, but even to some people who you would expect them to say that, say Robert Peston, the ITV political editor, even he had to tweet out in mild support of what Liz Truss was saying. As he tweets, as I've said before, Liz Truss is firmest territory when she criticises the Bank of England for allowing pension funds to take on excessive debt-fuelled exposure to government bonds via LDI schemes, liability-driven investments. For those who don't know, that essentially means that if you have a long-term financial commitment, i.e. paying out pensions to millions of people in the UK, you can get one of these investments that in theory are low risk, though it just means that you will invest in assets that will be able to be used as collateral to cover loans to pay for the financial commitments that you have. And the thing is that a lot of these LDIs from the Bank of England relied on government bonds. So if the bond market did what it did when Liz Truss was in charge and basically just go back to historical norms, i.e. go from a 1 to 2% yield return to 5%, then all of a sudden these LDIs did not have the funds they needed to pay off all these pensions. In other words, the Bank of England is holding the gilt market, or the government bond market, by the throat with a gun to its head, and if anything should happen to it, then the gun goes off and not only takes out the bond market, but takes out the rest of Britain and especially the pensioners. And if that didn't make any sense to you, I've linked a Wall Street Journal video down below. Please take a look at that if you're interested. It is extraordinary there has been no formal investigation of how this exposure was allowed to become so dangerous. Who knew what and when about it in the Bank of England, the Treasury and Whitehall, and precisely when Truss and Kwarteng were told about it, because according to them, they simply weren't told about it, and what impact it had on the government funding crisis that was sparked by the mini-budget. Which again, if something as small as that mini-budget, which in reality, and as a lot of people are realising in hindsight, really wasn't that insane, if insane at all, then how did it cause such a huge shockwave in the financial market, and how has recovery been so lacklustre? The impression has been created of an establishment cover-up. This is deeply unhealthy for democracy, and this is unironically probably one of Robert Peston's best takes that I've ever seen from him, because he's correct, and essentially agreeing with Liz Truss that there is a systemic problem. The Bank of England controls the finances of the government, when in reality they are both supposed to be independent of each other. It appears that the Bank of England has managed to get themselves in a position where the Treasury and the Chancellor of the Exchequer can't actually do anything other than stay with current orthodoxy, which is why they're very happy with Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt. And Robert Peston made another good point in yet another tweet about the implications of this systemic problem and what it means for the Tory party. Liz Truss's agenda: smaller state, yes please; lower tax, yes please; no compelled replacement of gas boilers and postponement of net zero measures, yes please, but please go further on that and just get rid of net zero as an idea completely; more regulatory divergence from the EU, yes please; planning deregulation to encourage house building, yes please; raising of pension age, yes please; total mistrust of the Whitehall establishment. I will never forgive the Tory party for taking all of this from me. I would have had biggest, the biggest party of my life had Liz Truss gone further with the mini budget. Well, no, put in the mini budget, actually implemented it, and by this point brought out a new budget basically saying all of this. No more funding of any government institution that has anything to do with Stonewall. Complete cut down of all climate regulation and any ministry to do with the climate. Complete supply side business reforms when it comes to government regulation of that, and especially for planning permission. Complete and utter removal of absolutely every illegal immigrant that comes across the border. If any of them do happen to be genuine refugees, well, we'll find out in Rwanda. A complete cut down of all the useless people in the civil service. You get the idea. Just all the stuff of him saying for years, it appears Liz Truss actually wanted. And I am not joking. I would have done so many celebratory live streams where I just get drunk with the other people, my other friends online, and we just have a great time talking about how she is basically Margaret Thatcher 2.0. Liz Truss is also highly critical of Sunak and Hunt's practice in government, if not always divergent from their privately held long-term aspirations, as she should be, to be quite honest. Because where I used to live, a relatively affluent part of Manchester, Rishi Sunak would sometimes just turn up, arrive by helicopter, turn up and talk to business leaders in my area, have lunch with them, intermingle with them, and one of their biggest points is probably to not allow small businesses to grow, keep the incestuous relationship between huge corporations and government going, and make it difficult to build houses, as then only the developers with the most amount of money can get anywhere close to actually building houses, with new builds that are not only shoddily built but look absolutely horrific. Truss's ideological challenge to Sunak is reminiscent of Wedgwood's to John Major in the mid-90s. These sort of revealed splits in a governing party are rarely conducive to electoral success, to put it mildly. However, I also think it's quite similar to when Margaret Thatcher was making her rise to power, although I think Liz Truss has completely pulled the rug from under herself in this case. I think she had to be a lot more patient with her ideas, but people wanted her, and then she couldn't actually do what she wanted, because the problem goes way deeper than I think she first realised. But the point being is that when Ted Heath was at the top of government and the Prime Minister, he was essentially just doing the same things as Labour, if not worse. We still had a 3-day working week. The unions were still bringing the country to its knees. And Margaret Thatcher and her entourage were effectively saying, can you not clearly see that this is all the issues? Thing is that these days the unions, well, I still think they are probably stronger than they probably should be, and not the huge problem, as clearly pointed out. It is more to do with the civil service, of course. The corporations who are lobbying for the ridiculous supply side regulations that we have at the moment, and of course all the eco-fanatics who are somehow being constantly pandered to by this Conservative government and every other party. It's insane. And Liz Truss has just come out and saying, look, these are obviously all the problems. People's lives are not improving, and certainly not improving to the rates that we have seen in the past. Can we not have a positive vision where we see, hey, look, you can do what you want with your own house. You're not being handcuffed to this heat pump that costs tens of thousands of pounds just to install, and we're not going to keep forcing your energy bills up. Energy will, in fact, be a bill that you don't really have to worry about. You will get to keep even more of your own money to spend on what you see fit. You will be able to finally afford train tickets if you so wish. And HS2 would probably actually be able to be built rather than have billions be put into it just to fight local NIMBYs. And this is from a person who doesn't even particularly want HS2. But genuinely, the biggest joke about, my affluent area of Manchester I used to live in, for most people there, is that the whole joke was that it was never going to be built in time for them to even see the benefits of it. So they were just going to live with all these heavy goods vehicles driving through their local villages on roads that are full of potholes as it is now, let alone in the future. And then in 20 years' time, when they're barely able to walk anymore, that's when HS2 will only just about be running. And that's obviously just not how a first world country should work. I mean, even in the Victorian times, we were just making railways here, there and everywhere. And the people absolutely loved it because it meant a cheap day out to Blackpool. But if what Robert Peston there didn't upset you enough, just wait till you hear this. Liz Truss's mini-budget nearly included a flat 20p rate of income tax. I absolutely hate the Tories for taking this woman away from us. Proposal from Jacob Rees-Mogg described as going full Estonia. I'm sure there is a bit more context to Estonia than just the fact that they have a 20 pence income tax rate. The flat tax that would have seen all workers pay just 20% of their income to the Treasury was considered for Liz Truss's disastrous mini-budget. Again, as we've gone through, her mini-budget was effectively like putting a match on an already blazing wildfire, where the Bank of England had already put gasoline absolutely everywhere in the vicinity anyway. In the summer before Truss became Prime Minister, Jacob Rees-Mogg, who later became her business secretary, submitted a 600-word memo setting out the proposal. His suggestion was referred to as going full Estonia by other senior Tories involved in discussions during the summer of 2022. And, well, sod senior Tories, they have got us into this mess anyway. And this just seems to show that the Tory party is infected with the same type of thought process that is in every socialist, in that they don't really want a fair system at all. They just want to punish the rich as much as they can. So the memo read, the opportunity for a flat tax on income should be explored. Hungary and Romania have flat taxes of 16%, Lithuania and Georgia of 20%. Less developed countries such as Mongolia and Kazakhstan also use them. Okay, sounds good to me. Estonia has a flat tax of 20%, although changed in 2018 created exemption bans, so strictly speaking this is now a partial flat tax. Research suggests the Baltic states' adoption of these in 1994-5 helped their rapid growth. We should aim for a 20% flat tax for income tax, corporation tax and capital gains tax without changing national insurance. Well, to be quite honest, I'd just get rid of national insurance and have a flat tax of 20%. But as Rees-Mogg says, there is study and evidence that a flat tax is very good for growth. So what's wrong with going full Estonia? They seem to be growing, especially post the fall of the Berlin Wall. Anyway, it was rejected because it was probably far too much of a shake-up of the tax system to be put in a mini-budget, so I don't really blame the government for not going along with it. But in hindsight, obviously, I am completely for them just taking a chainsaw to all current tax policy, supply-side policy, basically just all policy, and starting again from, 1997. Unfortunately, that is just not a realistic scenario, so we are basically going to need a full counter-revolution to Blair's revolution. And that could be a few years off yet, but hey, that is the ultimate white pill of the clown decade. Things could be getting so bad that Liz Truss may be seen as the most sane PM, as she was. However, Labour are clearly not in the headspace for taking on any of Liz Truss's lessons. Labour, we will weaponise Liz Truss' speech defending her legacy. As the first anniversary of her disastrous mini-budget approaches, the Times keep using that word and it's strange. The former Prime Minister has claimed that the economic consensus needs to be shattered in order to deliver growth. And given Labour want to do pretty much the same thing that the Tories are doing now, they are clearly not for growth either. They are part of the anti-growth coalition, as Liz Truss coined. Labour will this week seek to weaponise the anniversary of Liz Truss's disastrous mini-budget and forthcoming honours list, as she rejected claims she crashed the economy while in number 10. Which again, it is the point of how can something like the furlough scheme not cause a massive crash, and yet Liz Truss's promises, which costed nowhere near the amounts that the furlough scheme cost, cause a massive crash like this. These are questions that need to be answered. Labour will use the anniversary of the budget to remind people that they're still in the same party, despite Sunak's attempts to distance himself from his predecessor. Well, this is just a stupid move from Labour. This is clearly Liz Truss directly attacking Sunak. It doesn't matter if it's in the same party. People will be reminded that the Conservatives are indeed a broad church and do have people ranging from people who should be in the Labour Party to people who started UKIP. They will also highlight Truss's forthcoming honours list, which includes ennobling 4 people who were closely aligned with her policies and economic vision. We will weaponise it. The Prime Minister is changed, but it's the same party, a senior Labour source said. We will use it to warn you that they can't have another 5 years of the Conservatives, that they pose a biggest economic risk. And I do honestly think that this is going to be Labour's downfall. I think Labour's biggest problem is itself when it comes to the next election, because the Tories are all over the place, and as Liz Truss is constantly pointing out, and as I will keep pointing out, as a lot of people seem to realise, we are in the same orthodoxy since Blair, and it's clearly not been working. Everyone seems to agree that things don't seem that much better than they were 20 years ago. And while Labour, with their policies, are U-turning on everything and essentially just aligning themselves with Sunak and Jeremy Hunt's current economic model anyway, Their main differences are all cultural, and while Starmer is doing his best to make them seem patriotic, he still can't seem to get his finger on the people who think trans women are women, along with all the other cultural issues and the culture war that a lot of Labour seems to either be ignoring or actively on the bad side of. Whereas with the Tories, they're just passively letting that stuff happen and try not to get involved, or they are trying at least to do a limp-wristed defence of it. And when it comes to which one would you rather vote for, the answer is, well, I'd rather just spoil my ballot. But my God, at least the Conservatives do have people like Liz Truss in and Liz Truss's supporters. But since they have decided to go on the let's keep things terrible route, I don't see the point in voting for them. And the thing is, when you look at Labour as opposed to that, they want to do the same things, but they also hate Britain and all of its genuine traditional cultural institutions. And so their tactic of trying to just directly attack the Tory party at every turn, it's not going to work. You need to have a positive vision. How is this a lesson that politicians haven't learned? You need to set out a positive vision, explain how it's different from your opponent's vision, or if they don't have one, just keep going on about your own positive vision, and then push that. You need to give voters something that they are eager to vote for. And I understand a lot of people are tribalist idiots, but you don't need to go for their vote. Their mind's already made up. You need to go for the swing voters, the people actually engaged in this sort of thing, and say to them, look, you vote for me, here's what we'll do for the next 5 years. You've got to vote for us if you want those things to happen. And your plan can go beyond 5 years. You can say, look, we're planning to be voted in quite a few times. Are you ready to try and support us through that? And I know democracy doesn't have those incentives or do anything to try and make any politician think for more than 5 years at a time, or sometimes 2 weeks at a time. But I think at this point, people are really ready to vote for something that they can commit to for quite a few years, because they thought they were getting something with the Tories every time and they haven't. Truss really has to attack her own party, essentially, if when she or one of her supporters gets to be Tory leader, then they can actually put that plan into action and essentially have a decade like Margaret Thatcher's, where everything got better. But anyway, I think that's everything I can give you today. So once again, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.